Hello, you're very welcome to If I Were the Minister for Education, a regular podcast where I look at the world of primary education in Ireland and let you know what I would do if I were the Minister for Education. This is Simon Lewis. On this week's show, I will be talking about Israel and Gaza and how we can teach about the subject of war in the classroom. I have an interview with Paudie Moore, the teacher's coach, and I'll also be exploring how long it's going to take before we reach the government's target of 400 multi-denominational schools in Ireland. If you are interested in subscribing to the podcast, you can do so on your favourite podcasting platform, whether that's Apple Podcasts or Spotify or any of your other favourite podcasting platforms. You can also look and follow this podcast on my YouTube channel, where you can see some of the articles being read live. And you can also click and subscribe and be notified for those as well. If you are further interested in the podcast, I provide a lot of a newsletter where I look at lots of other interesting stories that have happened in the world of primary education. And you can see those on my Feedly, interesting Irish education stories, and you can see those there. And you can also subscribe to that on shot.net/subscribe, where you can get an email into your inbox every 2 weeks with all my news and thoughts on the Irish education system, as well as some bonus material, including some educational technology advice. This week, I'm looking at the end of the year, and maybe the rain has come and sports day's been cancelled and you don't have anything planned. I have an emergency geography lesson with the help of AI to help you through. So hopefully you'll enjoy that. So without further ado, let's get on with this week's programme. So I need to talk about Israel. As many of you, I come from a Jewish background, and in some ways I've really been avoiding talking about the terrible war that's been going on in Gaza for the last number of months. And I haven't been avoiding it for any other reason that I guess I've been a little bit afraid to talk about it, because in some ways I don't know enough. Like many of you who went to school, I also went to school, and and like you probably went to a school which indoctrinated you into some way of thinking. Most of you probably went to a Catholic school, and you would have been taught faith formation in Catholicism, and you would have been raised, and in sometimes in very subtle ways, sometimes very much deliberately, in the fact that Catholicism was the true way of life and that worshipping Jesus was the way of life. And it probably has translated, even if you don't believe in a lot of the messages or even a lot of the religiosity of it, you hear a lot of people calling themselves cultural Catholics, which is a kind of a strange phrase, because in some ways Catholicism isn't an ethnicity as such, but it's almost become cultural in Ireland, insofar as you have many families who may not believe in God at all. In fact, we have lots of teachers from the latest Grace report that don't believe in God and are expected to pass on the message of Catholicism in schools. You have this very strange kind of situation. And again, as we leave what is known as even the fact that we have a communion season in Ireland, it suggests that the vast majority of people who reject Catholicism and its teachings and its dogma will still go through with making their children do sacraments, and they see it as not a religious event, despite the fact that it's a religious event. And we'll talk about, I don't think there's an episode of this podcast where I don't explore the harm that can cause to families who don't go into this sort of strange cultural phenomenon that only really happens in Ireland, where parents have essentially outsourced the religiosity of the Catholic faith so they can have a kind of a party once when the child turns 8, and where they thoughtlessly don't think about the children that don't do that and have to sit at backs of classrooms. I was no different in some way, that I went to a religiously run school myself. It was a Jewish school, and as part of going to a Jewish school, I was taught the Jewish faith as truth, and as many, I don't believe in the religiosity of the Jewish faith. I don't believe in a God. I don't believe in much of the dogma and faith formation that I would have been taught as truth. I don't believe in prayer. I don't believe in the dietaries. I don't believe in any of the religious sort of, which wouldn't be uncommon as much as it's not uncommon for many of you who are listening. But you do get that sort of hangover that many of you might have in terms of not seeing any harm in things that are actually harmful in many ways. That I, for example, these aren't harmful to anybody else but myself. For example, I still can't bring myself to eating most pork products. I find that very difficult. And there's no other reason other than the fact that for the first 14 years of my life, when I did believe in the faith that I was being raised in, that pork was seen as dirty and a bad food. And I actually even remember, this is how rooted this sort of stuff is in me. I remember the first time I ate a pork sausage and I planned it. I was living in Galway at the time. I was away from home and I don't even know why I was there, because I believe it was some GAA event. And I was in Galway on my own and I saw a big plate of pork sausages. You know, those cocktail sausages. They're like, and I just really wanted to try one. I really wanted to do this. It was almost like this kind of, in fact, I don't know, a ceremony where this is where I was finally going to whip off the last shackles of the faith I was raised in. And I remember eating that sausage and going through it. I know that sounds very trite, but you probably recognize a lot of this in yourself, maybe in Catholicism, that, for example, you're standing or you're sitting in a church in your finery, or you've decorated your house and your child is going up to an altar in a sort of in a communion dress. And maybe you see, what am I doing here? Why am I going through with this? You might have that thought of, what am I doing this for? And the sort of almost vulgarity potentially of it, or maybe you don't, and so on. I'm trying to be, there's many Catholics who are very happy with their religion, and absolutely that I'm not saying what you're doing is wrong. It's just some of you who may have left the religiosity of your religion behind and are still going around thoughtlessly doing it. And I'm not referencing anyone in particular there, but there was an article this week in the Irish Times from Sean Moncrief, who was going through his fourth child's communion and seems to thoughtlessly do it without thinking of the potential harm that's causing to children that might be in his daughter's class, who were sitting at the back of classrooms for half the year while his child was going through, I suppose, what he doesn't even take seriously as a religion. But the reason I'm telling you all this as background is one of the things I suppose, and I will call it harmful, was the fact that in my school I remember learning about Zionism as a concept from a very early age. And even growing up, I would have been sent to youth groups in Ireland that would essentially be Zionist groups, the B'nai B'rith Youth Organisation being one I remember. I know I would have had to, there would have been, like the way you get trochara boxes in your school, we would have had a JNF box where you would raise money to plant trees. In Israel, we were told that that was what it was for, and I'm sure there's no doubt that was what it was for. But a lot of like subtle sort of stuff that you probably do yourself. The trochara box is to help the poor, but it is also as a missionary thing where you're also going out and there's missionaries out there convincing people to believe in Jesus Christ and things like that. I would have had all that, and I would have learned the history of the state of Israel and the struggle for that land, because obviously from biblical times, if you believe in those biblical times, that land has had many owners, many people in control of it, and there's been many fights, because obviously a lot of that land is seen by many Semitic religions, as all Semitic religions, holy land, Jerusalem, Nazareth, and many other places that you probably know quite well from if you've studied the Bible. And I suppose I would never have heard the Palestinian side of the story. And that's what I suppose I want to get at here. And I haven't really, in some ways, when you grow up and you try and learn a little bit about the situation, the conflict, the wars, that you have freedom to look at it from a different perspective. And I suppose I've spent the last few years exploring the Palestinian story and the Nakba. As I said, I'd never heard that word before. And I've listened to Palestinian voices. I've listened to Jewish voices who would have sympathies with the Palestinian cause. And I've obviously listened, and I've listened all my life to the Zionist sort of state of affairs, and have come to the conclusion that most Irish people have come to, that the current war as it stands at the moment is absolutely a complete mess. And all we are seeing, what I'm seeing is we have no good guys in charge here. We have a very right-wing Israeli government that if it wasn't the state of Israel, we would be absolutely calling out for human rights abuses and war crimes. And just because it is the state of Israel, I believe that isn't being called out. And on the other side, we have a group, Hamas, who are no better. Again, a group of people who want to destroy a nation and also a religion, and the part of it, and I'll go into this a little bit more about their aims. And then you have innocent people being killed, absolutely just for no other reason because of where they are in this world, on this map. And it's not okay. And I feel I have nothing much to offer. If this was a beach, what I'm about to offer isn't even worth a grain of sand. And I want to make sure that I say that, because all I am is just some guy in front of a microphone who knows nothing, really, who knows nothing. And I think a lot of us are in that boat, and we're in that bracket. And we have access to an internet where we can state opinions. And this is just one other. And I suppose what I would say to you is the only thing you should take maybe a little bit seriously from what I'm about to say is maybe just as another voice in the many voices that are there, but more importantly, the resources that I'm hoping that I might share with you. Because as teachers, I do feel we have a responsibility to look at humanitarianism, human rights, war, even with children who are very young, and explore why war is never a good thing or even acceptable in many ways. And how do we explore that concept? How do we explore the humanity or the lack of humanity when it comes to war? And in particular, in this war, where I think it's slightly different, let's say, to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where there's very much an agreement that there's good guys and bad guys in it. Whereas with Israel, and Gaza, there is, obviously many people will say there's good guys and bad guys in it, but in some ways this is slightly different, because not everybody, there isn't a collective or a universal agreement that Israel are bad guys and Gaza are the good guys. Some people will have the opposite view, and then some people might have my view, which is that the leadership in both camps is horrendous and shocking, and things need to stop, because they won't. And I don't know how it's going to stop. If I knew that, I don't think I'd have this job. But then, anyway, so why now? Why am I speaking now? And in some ways, I think it really came from Michael D. Higgins a couple of weeks ago, who basically came out to talk about the war in Gaza, and the fact that a lot of people are saying there's a lot of Jewish people saying they're feeling afraid of being in Ireland now, because they're saying there's a growing anti-Semitism in Ireland. And Michael D. Higgins said there is no anti-Semitism in Ireland. There is absolutely no anti-Semitism in Ireland. And I just wanted to share a few tweets that I've been getting in the last few weeks. I grew up in Ireland, really rarely, if ever, having any anti-Semitism at all, where people would use my ethnicity, which is Jewish, and to I suppose, be racist towards me. Very rarely, as I say, I often joke in the summer, when I tan a little more easily than most Irish people, that as a teenager, some summers I'd be shouted across the road to go back to my own country. And I always was very happy to reply in my, albeit posh, Irish accent. It was an Irish accent that I was already in Ireland, in my home country. And every so often there might be a little bit of a thing that would happen. But in the last few months, I'm on a weekly basis getting messages which are clearly anti-Semitic. There's just a few of them on the screen if you're watching along on YouTube, and some of them are very interesting, like Jew detected, being two words that really were difficult to read, and just two words, and it's interesting. But then the other one that's there that made me make the decision to do this was so condescending. This is from someone called A. Hrua Younger. So condescending, because I don't know what I said. I was speaking about multi-denominational schools, which I will be again in a few minutes, that I'm so condescending. And don't you have Arab children to murder? That was the question that I was asked. And I just thought, look, there is this correlation. And yes, maybe I should have spoken up earlier in this, or said something earlier, but I just didn't see the point of it. And just with this, I said, oh, look, the very small kind of number of people that might listen to this, maybe they ask those questions themselves. I notice, I would imagine that if I wasn't Jewish and I knew someone who was Jewish, the first question I'd like to ask them was, well, what do you think about the Israeli-Palestine situation? And people have asked me that when they see me, and I tell them exactly what I've told you there. And I think I don't speak for the Jewish community by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, I imagine I do exactly the opposite. But I'm one voice, as I said. And I suppose that's what I wanted to talk to you about. I've written about President Higgins' thing about no anti-Semitism in Ireland. And I just wanted to, and essentially you can read a little bit more on those, on that if you want to. And I've put some links to other areas where there is anti-Semitism. If you're looking along, you'll probably see some imagery there that might give you cause for concern, particularly the one I'm hovering on about there, which is images of Jewish people in fairly derogatory memes or whatever you might call them. But also some other examples of people who have got to talk to people who look Jewish in some ways, which is interesting without being Jewish. So I thought that was something worth talking about. And I know I've been talking quite a bit and I have a lot to cover, but I do want to talk about Israel. And I'm going to go through an article I wrote on my Medium blog, that's simonmlewis.medium.com, about Israel, which has had some small amount of reaction. And at the crux of this is bad things happen when good people do nothing. This is one lesson I was taught in school, the one, maybe one inarguable thing that you could teach to a Jewish kid in a Jewish school, because this was in the context of the Holocaust. And I remember when I was very young, in fact, I remember it was senior infants when I first learned about the Holocaust. I don't know, people would say that's appropriate, but I remember I actually wrote a poem called Six White Candles a number of years ago about my experience of being taught about the Holocaust and how weird that was for a 6-year-old to learn about this death and 6 million people being killed because they were Jewish. And in a way, it was there, and this is taught to me, as I said, this was taught to me in a way to basically teach me to be afraid. And it's something I think, I could be wrong on this now, but a lot of Jewish people spend a lot of their lives afraid that this is going to happen again. And that just for being Jewish, you should be afraid. And I remember through the course of my life, I remember going to Israel to represent Ireland in the Jewish Olympics, if that is a thing. And I remember being really interested in that. The main question I was asked when I was in Israel, is there a lot of anti-Semitism in Ireland? This sort of obsession that people are anti-Semitic amongst in Israel or anywhere you go. And do you experience a lot of anti-Semitism? And it was an interesting thing to me. It was a question. And it's all down, obviously, to do with the Holocaust and so on. And I guess I grew up in a very different time when I was more conscious of Israel as a teenager, a much more peaceful time. And I could be wrong on this. Again, remember, I was only getting one side of the story. But I grew up in an Israel with Yitzhak Rabin as the leader of Israel, the Labour Party, a more liberal form of Zionism, if such a thing exists, and there was talk of a two-state solution, peaceful talks. And Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a very right-wing Jewish person. And at that time, I've learned since that you had a younger Benjamin Netanyahu who was stoking the flames of this idea that Benjamin Netanyahu was actually going against this form of Zionism that we now know in the 21st century, this very right-wing, aggressive Zionism where Israel is now a nation state. I think my last kind of, I suppose, bit of support, or whatever that would be, I don't even think support's the right word, for Israeli policy ended in 2018 when they introduced the nation state law, and I'll talk about that in a second. But I do want to say that when people speak to me about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and how I feel as someone who's raised in the Jewish faith, but also as an Irish person, giving the overwhelming support of the Palestinian state in this country, they often ask me if I feel safe anymore. And I just want to say that I recognise the irony of that questioning, because my safety is overwhelmingly dwarfed when compared to families living in fear for their lives every single minute of every single day in Gaza. So I want to point that out before this becomes a kind of I feel unsafe kind of thing. I know there's thousands and thousands of families, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of families that may never feel safe again. And I just want to say that. Basically, as I said, I receive now at least one anti-Semitic remark a week online, which I never did before the October 7th war that started. And as much as it makes me feel less safe, I don't feel unsafe. I think I have had to wonder, what is it that makes me feel less safe, let's say, because it's not pleasant getting anti-Semitic remarks by any stretch of the imagination. It's never good for your ethnicity to be pointed out or threatened, or to feel that it's being threatened and to be looking over your shoulder. But my entire blame lies with the Israeli government here, because it's not Hamas that are making me feel unsafe, to be honest, here in Ireland. Now, Israeli Jews might say that they feel offended by me saying that. But as an Irish person living in Ireland, and as someone from a Jewish ethnicity, my lack of safety lies with the Israeli government, who are relentlessly murdering thousands of people, supposedly in my name. And it's not my name. They have single-handedly turned a terrorist group, Hamas, who are a terrorist group that nobody would have supported a few years ago, into some legitimate revolutionaries. If you look at Hamas's charter, this is from 1988 and it hasn't changed. The day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight the Jews. When the Jew will hide behind stones and trees. The stones and trees will say, "Oh Muslims, oh Abdullah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him." And then it goes on. But, in that charter, this is the Hamas charter, which hasn't changed. They mention Israel quite a bit and how it should be destructed and they don't recognize it. But it also on 12 occasions mentions Jews, people with the ethnicity of Jewishness. It's not, as David Baddiel has said in his book, that even though he doesn't believe in God, much like me, he would be still tomorrow, if the Gestapo came along, he would be murdered, much like I would be. And this is, I suppose, where the fear is. We know that's happening. But the only reason, I suppose, the fear is because Hamas are not a threat to me in Ireland, is because of what Israel is doing to rise Hamas up as a legitimate organisation who, quite bluntly, would want to wipe out anyone who is Jewish. And to me, in this war, as I've said, there's no goodies and baddies. There's simply victims. And unfortunately, when one oppresses a nation of people, one can only expect that nation to rise up. And we know that from our own history. I share Ireland's recognition of the state of Palestine. We need the moment of two-state solution, very much like what we have here. And I hope it will lead to convincing more powerful nations who actually have some sort of influence. It's interesting. Ireland is like me here. In a way, we're nothing. Israelis don't care what Irish people think, really. And the same way as Israel, no one cares what I say. But I guess if everybody is speaking out in some different way, the hope is that you convince more powerful people, more powerful nations to support some sort of peaceful outcome to the absolutely devastating crisis. You need to remember, though, that peace won't happen, whether it's Netanyahu's government who are in charge or whether Hamas are in charge. We need to ensure that the right people are in charge of this coming on. Now, a lot of people, and I suppose the point of this really, in a way, and this is going to be a bit of a longer episode than usual by the looks of things, because I have a lot to say. A lot of people might ask me about my own opinion, and you'll hear this yourself if you're someone who's at a Palestinian solidarity march, or you're a lot of people who would be pro-Israel in inverted commas, would have asked me the same questions that I have to ask myself. I always think it's important to ask questions, no matter how uncomfortable they are. And one of the questions I'm asked is, why Israel? Why is everybody in Ireland just focusing on Israel? There's genocides. The argument is basically there's genocides and wars and humanitarian crises happening all over the world. I just learned over the weekend of loads and loads of other genocides that are happening before our eyes that I never even knew were happening. Brazil, for example, a journalist I was listening to over the weekend, and there's 60,000 black Brazilians murdered every year in the state of Brazil. I had no idea. It's absolutely nuts to hear that. But all these things are happening over the world. So why are you Irish? Why are you Irish, they say? And the politicians and the media only focusing on Israel? And they follow, and the logic really from the point of question is it's down to anti-Semitism. That Ireland is an anti-Semitic country. Now, I know it isn't, but at the same time, I know anti-Semitism exists in the same way as racism exists, in the same way as anti-migrant xenophobia exists. And we know it exists. I'm recording this as the local elections are unfolding. We're seeing the rise of people who are anti-migrant getting elected. And they are getting elected. I know a lot of them aren't, but some are. And that's quite a scary notion. But anyway, back to why only Israel? Surely it's anti-Semitic, blah, 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 blah. And they give examples. They say Yemen, China, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Iran, Afghanistan. And they list countries where there are absolutely massacres, humanitarian crises, genocides happening. And we hear very little of them. And people even point out that about the Taoiseach, for example, was it Micheál Martin or Leo Varadkar at the time? I think it was Leo Varadkar at the time, who met when the Chinese premier came over to Ireland. He shook his hand. And what is this saying when the Chinese are killing groups of people in China because of their ethnicity? We also have the Russian invasion of Ukraine going on with very little. The focus on that seems to have waned quite a bit because of Israel. And in fact, there's a growing animosity from some of these xenophobic people to Ukrainian refugees in Ireland, thanks to that growing right-wing rhetoric that's infecting us in this island. I, though, don't genuinely believe that Ireland's stance against Israel, as opposed to other countries, has anything to do with Judaism. Israel's supposed to be a Western democracy, whereas the others aren't. I listed some of those countries there. You don't ever look at those as Western democracies. So it's only natural, I feel, when a Western democracy behaves unlike a Western democracy, it's only natural that we hold them to a higher account than we would to a country that is an autocracy or an autocracy. And I still think in Ireland, and we'll see this, and you hear this on the radio, particularly now as we're doing the local elections and the European election, we still consider democracy to be one of the most important things that we have in our Western civilization. And when it's being abused in the way that it currently is by Israel, we stand against it more strongly than we would. And whether that's a Christian state, a Muslim state, or a Jewish state, if they state that they are democracies, they need to behave like democracies, in my view. And I hear many Irish people discussing apartheid as well. So this is another thing I hear Irish people when speaking about Israel. And they talk about apartheid-free zones, and they talk about we need BDS, we need all this sort of stuff. And they ask me, and people talk to me about this again when they're happy enough to talk to me about it. And they're absolutely correct. And I don't know when they say it's an apartheid state, whether they know when it became an apartheid zone, an apartheid country. And effectively, it became officially an apartheid state in 2018 when they enacted the nation-state laws, which effectively makes all people in Israel who are not Jewish second-class citizens. This is a nation-state laws that Netanyahu brought in 2018. It was the last straw I ever had for any sort of sympathy or affiliation I had for an Israeli state, for the Zionist cause, if you want to call it a cause. And in my view, no country, no matter who they are, should favour any citizen any more than any other citizen on the basis of any of the human rights that they would have. So in Ireland, we have 9 grounds for discrimination. And if anyone is treated differently because of one of those rights, that is wrong, no matter what. And Israel has basically said that it is a Jewish state and that Jewish people are treated more favourably than other people. And that's wrong by any stretch of the imagination. And it is apartheid because it treats people unequally on the basis of their religion. And it's why I continuously campaign against our own apartheid in our primary education system. Because we have one. And I understand that people only really care about apartheid systems when people are being killed and murdered. But an apartheid system where citizens are treated differently because of their ethnicity or race doesn't have to become intolerable just when people are killed. Our primary education system is an apartheid one, where in the vast majority of cases, and I know people don't like to hear the word apartheid when we're talking about a primary education. In the same way they don't like me saying indoctrination. In fact, lots of people switch off when I say we have an indoctrination system in our education system. They prefer faith formation. But words matter. And this is why people don't like it. In the same way as when I say schools aren't inclusive, people jar with that because it's a criticism. And so nobody likes to be criticised. But just looking at the definition of the word apartheid, it's when you treat people unequally because of their culture, their faith, their race, their background, things like that. So in our primary education system, which is an apartheid one, the vast majority of cases of schools, one faith is promoted over all others in 96% of schools, in the same way as in Israel, that Jewishness is promoted over all other faiths in its state. And we dress it up with the same propaganda that Israel uses, announcing that we're inclusive because we allow children of all faiths or none into our schools. Israel will say that they are in a democracy, they're inclusive because they allow. You hear them saying 20% of the Knesset, the government, are Arabs. They're allowed into the Knesset, into their equivalent of the Dáil. But does it mean they're treated equally? No, is the answer. The children in our schools are expected to either accept the doctrine being taught in our schools or to sit at the backs of classrooms as second-class citizens in their own local schools. And we've the exact. So I'm going to move on to another example. Our primary teachers union, the INTO, has a Palestinian solidarity group, and they're rightly so. I absolutely support that. But they were asking their members to have a solidarity day in their schools on the 5th of June. Then they asked schools to designate themselves apartheid-free zones. You can see how I feel that's quite ironic. I can imagine people out there, most Irish primary school teachers would have, whether they did it or didn't do it on the 5th of June, they probably didn't think that they may very well be teaching in an apartheid system themselves. Again, I know people will probably be very cross with me for saying that, because obviously no one's been killed in our schools. I wouldn't go as far as saying no one's being harmed. People are being harmed, but no one's being harmed in the same way as obviously Palestinian kids and Palestinian people are being. But it doesn't mean it isn't apartheid. And I think it's important to point things out. I can't not say that. But as I'm saying it, I'm doing something that I'm advising against now, which is politicizing things, politicizing schools. It's very dangerous. And I think we tend to avoid it in Ireland. We try to not politicize schools. And I think as schools, we need to teach children about politics. We need to teach children about injustice. We need to teach children about human rights. But we also need to be very careful when we're doing it. So for example, when we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we advised strongly, and I remember this very clearly, I'm sure some of you do, is to always remember that in our schools, we had Russian children, and they needed to be as protected as our Ukrainian children who were also amongst us, and also the new Ukrainian children who were fleeing this war. And in fact, over the last 20 years, Irish schools or more have been welcoming refugees from all countries and asylum seekers from all over the world. And it's important to ensure that all children are protected from alienation. And Israeli children have no part in this war, no more than the Russian children had in Ukraine. And it's incumbent that we don't forget that. We have to make sure that we don't alienate a nation of people because of the acts of their governments. If you have any Burmese students in your school, you don't treat them any differently, let's say, to Rohingyan children. If you have any of their Tamil kids and Sri Lankan kids, we need to treat our children. It's not their fault that there's a war going on. We need to remember that. We don't avoid discussing the horrors of war, but we need to remember that war is much more complicated than goodies and baddies. And I think that's the message I want to bring to this. There were many good Germans during the Second World War that tried against hope to help Jewish people escape Europe to safety. There are many Israelis and Jews who are demanding that the war in Palestine stopped. As when it comes to any ongoing war in schools, we need to look at solutions, not to take sides. And with that in mind, and I'm sorry this episode has gone much longer than it usually would, let's get some solutions. And if you're on YouTube there right now, you'll see some of these solutions, and I'll just go through them very quickly. But I'm going to put links into my show notes so that you can also be able to use them if you like. There's really good resources out there for teaching about war with a focus on Palestine and Israel and Gaza and how that works. And I'm including Irish resources as well as some international resources. And the first one I'm going to show you is one that's already 6 months old, and it's a 3-point guide to the conflict in Gaza. And it's the first place you should look as a guide, and it's really relevant. I also suggested you look at Trócaire. Trócaire has spent a lot of time, and one of their main things, I wouldn't normally recommend Trócaire because I suppose I have an issue with their denominational aspect, but their school resources are generally are excellent. And the Tree of Justice is a fantastic resource, which I really recommend. And Trócaire had to be very careful with how they presented the resources, because again, they have the same dilemma that we have, as they're not allowed to take sides. and I think it's very useful. That resource is very useful. Another Irish resource is from the National Youth Council of Ireland, which discusses war generally with young people, which you can have a look at. And then moving on, the British Red Cross have a really good resource about humanitarian work and and you learn about the work that they're doing in Israel and Palestine. It's very well done. And then another Catholic agency, and it's interesting to me that I'm recommending Catholic agencies as good resources. As I said, nothing is ever 100% black and white. A religion can be a force for good, and I often say this. And this is a good UK resource from a Catholic agency. Again, resources that would be very good for 5th and 6th class, which is a good age maybe to cover this. Finally, I think we have another UK resource from DECSY from Yorkshire, and they've come up with some really good lesson plans and teaching resources which might be good for senior classes as well. However, I would suggest that the best thing you can probably do is outside of your classroom. Attend the protests and the solidarity marches and campaign for peace in the region. I know it's a small thing to do, but get out and stand with like-minded people. Stop this atrocity and be there and stand there and make sure you're there. But not only that, put your hand in your pocket. Of all the things you could possibly do, put your hand in your pocket and donate to those humanitarian causes where real help can be offered to real people who need that money to survive in awful conditions. Give them your money and make sure you do that. There's no point in throwing up stuff on Instagram or throwing stuff on social media about and all the rest of it without doing any of that. By all means, put stuff on Instagram, but put your hands in your pocket as well, because we need to learn. You also need to learn about the history of how we got to this terrible place. Don't simplify this. This is not a simple war. This isn't going to end just if Israel stopped killing people. This is deep rooted. Learn about the history of how Zionism has now been weaponized by very bad people to try and legitimize the massacre of thousands and thousands of people, and try to help people understand that Zionism and Judaism are not the same thing. Help people understand that Hamas and Palestine are not the same thing. There are enough victims in this war without making correlations that will cause even more harm. And I guess that's where I might stop when I'm talking about Israel. I hadn't expected to go on for so long, and I'm sorry if some of it was difficult to listen to. And do you know what? As I said, it is not even a grain of sand on the beach of opinion. It is an opinion from someone who's in the system in some way and might have, slightly different views, but not particularly different either. I hope the resources, if nothing else, are useful to you. I do want to move on to, I guess, lighter stories, and in some ways, and I am going to move to something completely different, as Monty Python would say. Or perhaps it deserves an episode in itself, which it does. And I am moving on to a completely light but very important subject for teachers, because all this is very heavy. And teaching has become very difficult over the last number of years, in particular with additional needs causing a huge number of extra work for teachers. Behaviour in schools has become very difficult since COVID in lots of ways, dealing with conflict in generally. And it's causing a lot of teachers to leave the profession, where I do go on a lot about people who are leaving the profession who wouldn't have necessarily done so. The job of a teacher has become very difficult. And what makes it worse for me sometimes is people saying you need to look after your well-being without telling you how to look after your well-being. So I've interviewed a number of people over the last number of years around well-being for teachers, but I have often focused on, and I suppose that's the main thing, with the focusing on well-being of children, which is obviously very important. What about teachers? And I was very lucky to come across Paudie Moore, who is a teacher coach, and he runs the Teachers Coach on Instagram, where he is actually interested in helping teachers to look after their own well-being. And I did a really good interview, which I've posted online. It's on you can find it on onshaw.net on my interviews page. It's my 21st interview. And I talked to Paudie Moore about teacher well-being, about teacher fitness, and about being the best you can be, being in a state of health where you can be the best teacher you can be. And I'll just play a short clip of that interview now, about a minute and a half, where I ask Paudie, what can teachers actually do to help with their own well-being? I'm going to play that, about a minute of it. But if you want to hear the full episode, and I really recommend you do, go on to onshaw.net and have a listen. It's definitely worth your while.
I think that they're going to need to know, number one, how to be able to put strong boundaries in place, how to be able to have a better work-life balance so that they're not, like we said earlier, burning the candle on both ends, bringing work home with them, and then showing up on maybe 30 to 40% battery at all times. They need to be taught how to be able to create energy, how to be able to manage their energy so that they're going to be able to show up at their best as a leader for their class, for their students, even for their colleagues. I think that would be one thing that where I would start with. Secondly, I think what teachers need is to be taught how to be able to have more helpful coping mechanisms in place. I think the job itself, as we said earlier, it's quite demanding both physically, mentally, and emotionally. And I feel that if you're not sure how to be able to re-energize yourself physically, mentally, and emotionally, it's going to be very hard for you to give back at your very best in as well. And I think that without that knowledge, it's too easy to then turn to the unhelpful coping mechanisms. And that's why so many people that we deal with, they struggle a lot with snacking, with comfort eating. Some people might even turn to alcohol to help self-soothe because they don't know any better way of helping to deal with that stress.
Yeah.
So I think that equipping teachers with strategies, with skills of how to be able to overcome these would enable them to be able to show up in a much better way.
So I hope you enjoyed that interview, and I recommend, as I say, listening to the full thing. And I just wanted to very briefly, because I can see we're nearly an hour into this episode, but as I said, I really wanted to tackle the question and the questions that have been asked of me about Gaza and so on. And as I said, it's something I've wanted to do for a while and never really found a way into it. But as I said, I have now. But slightly linked is in terms of, as I said, I argued that we have an apartheid primary education system here in Ireland. And I was very interested in two things that came out, and I'll mention them very briefly. The first really is the report that comes out nearly every year, and it's a wonderful, wonderful report. And I go on about this. I actually usually just summarize the whole thing as a full episode, but I'm actually going to give it less than 5 minutes today, unfortunately. But I'd really recommend that you look at it. It is the Children's Schools Life study, and their report number 7 has come out. And this time, number 7 is about the sense of belonging. I'm sorry, it's not about sense of belonging. It's about a lot of things, but one of the things is about belonging. It's actually about well-being. So it really ties in quite a lot of what we're talking about today. I like when that happens in my episodes. The stories all intertwine among each other. And they do talk about children's well-being, and it's actually quite good if you read the report. It's not as bad as we all think. Now, there are obviously problems, but children in schools do feel safe, and that's really nice. But the chapter I was really particularly interested in was their sense of belonging, school belonging, into page 27. And I mentioned this because one of the times in school where I feel belonging really happens in the school is when we all do something together, where the school community comes together to celebrate. But this time of the year, many of you will be preparing to say goodbye to your 6th class, and you may have a graduation ceremony, and all the school comes together to say goodbye and wish the 6th class good luck when they come into school. Another time in the year where we all come together might be a concert around Christmas time or in winter time, where the school comes together and the community comes together to celebrate being in school. In Catholic schools, that's usually or in Christian schools, it's usually through a nativity play or through a Christmas concert. In schools like mine and in Educate Together, we would have a winter concert where we maybe pick a theme and everyone comes together for that theme. We belong. And the thing is, it's the idea of belonging to a school community. And I suppose what I was very interested in, and it's a question I'm going to leave hanging in a way because I've touched on it in the previous, when I was talking about Israel-Gaza and Apartheid, is how do all children belong when it comes to sacramental time in Catholic schools? And obviously the answer is no. And I know a lot of schools will do everything they can to make children feel that they belong. And I get this argument from a lot of Catholic principals who said, but we include families in the ceremony. They can go up to the priest and get a blessing, or they sing in the choir, where they're invited to the ceremony. And the thing is, that's all lovely, and it's all, and I can see the aspiration to try and include and help children belong, but they don't. They are not actually in the community. They are visitors at this point. And this is something that's really important to me as when it comes to school. And this is the bit where, and this is why I go on so much about this all the time. No matter how much you try to make a child feel that they belong in your school, if the structures that are in place, and these are not schools' fault, but if the structures are in place where only some, or even if most of the children are part of that community, and you're excluding even one child from that community because of their religion, or because of their race, or because of their ethnicity, then we need to change the system, because you cannot have a system where children don't belong. And I was interested in the CSL study as to whether that came out when it came to school belonging. And I have to say, I was disappointed that it didn't. It's not in the report. And I was so disappointed that I contacted the CSL people, and I presume if an email comes from me to some organisations, go, oh no, not him. What's he going to do now? And I just asked them, and I said, look, I love the reports. I'm always going about how brilliant they are, and I genuinely mean that. But I did ask them, look, I was interested. Did they get any feedback in terms of second class and sixth class and that idea of belonging? And they have said that, look, yes, they did get some feedback on it, and they're hoping to be able to share it. But obviously, these reports can only give so much. And I think I would love, I suppose I haven't read what those things were, but they did assure me that it did come up. And I hope maybe that will be shared at some point. And when it is, I'm looking forward to going through it and reading it, because I do think that schools do a really good job of trying to convince people that they do make people feel that they belong in their school communities, even when they don't. And I feel you have to be hypercritical of a system where you have, and I bring this back to my Sean Moncrief article, where you have someone like Sean Moncrief, who in some ways, he ticks the no religion box. This is what he says: I tick no religion in the census, but all 4 of my children have gone through the sacraments. And he's very unapologetic for it. In fact, sometimes he celebrates that hypocrisy, and he claims that the reason he does it is because he feels he's not anti-Catholic, as if that's the reason he does it. It's not that he's, my question mark isn't about being for example, my child didn't make the communion, not because I'm anti-Catholic. In fairness, I'm far from anti-Catholic. But the reason he didn't make his sacraments was because he's not Catholic. Simple as that. And it's not because he's against Catholicism or I'm against Catholicism. It's because he's not Catholic. And no more than Sean Moncrief's kids are probably not Catholic. And in his article this year, he said that the priest made them think about children all over the world who are not belonging into their communities. And he referenced, without saying exactly where it was, but he referenced Gaza. He referenced places outside of Ireland. And I suppose the question I asked him, or I am asking, is what about the children in his children's classrooms that also are not belonging? And it's the question I asked to CSL as well. And some will say to me, but look, over time it'll be fine, it'll be grand. And look, we're having more and more multi-denominational schools. And that kind of leads me to my final thought, my final thing, which is a press release from Education Equality, wonderful organisation. And as many people know, the government are saying we will have 400 schools by 2030. And at this rate, they calculated, which I thought was quite funny, or not funny, it's sad. What year, at the rate that we've been going since the Pluralism and Patronage Forum, what year will it be when we do have 400 schools? And 400 schools, by the way, is 12% of schools. By no means is this equality, but we will all be dead, long dead. In fact, our grandchildren may be dead by the time it happens. At this rate, we will get to 400 multi-denominational schools in 2171. That's the year at that rate. And it's not good enough. And I guess the message I have for this episode is there's a lot of stuff in this world that isn't good enough. It's not good enough that we have a war going on where we have terrible people doing terrible things to innocent people. And it filters down to this whole idea of Bad things happen when good people do nothing. And we need to look at Israel, Palestine. We need to look at ourselves as teachers in Ireland. We need to look at ourselves. We need to look at what we do here. We need to look at what we do everywhere. And we need to make sure that we do something more than tokenism, more than ignoring the bad things that are going on. And we do something about them. I'm not saying what I'm doing is doing anything particularly. This is all I have. Maybe this is what I can do. I don't know if it's, again, I don't think it's very much. As I said, it's not even a grain of sand on the beach, but it's not nothing either. So look, with that in mind, I wish you all the very best. I hope this has been of use to you. Maybe this is one of my more useful episodes. It's not just giving out. It's not whinging about. I haven't even mentioned the Minister for Education in this episode. But if I were the Minister for Education, I think we could take a lot from what's going on in Ireland, in the world, and that we stand up for what's right, whatever that might be. Thanks so much for listening. All the very best. Bye-bye.